Here in chapters 5 and 6, we're going to talk about some listening and core interviewing skills, which will be a revisit from an earlier chapter, but it's worth mentioning again, especially in the new context that we'll be learning. So now that we've had a little bit more experience and we've we've worked on some definitions of some of those core interviewing skills, we'll revisit them as a way to embellish them, so to speak, so that we can put a little more girth to them. Instead of just being able to call them something, we can talk about them in the context of an actual helping relationship. So let's just talk about good listening first, and this is again a Rogerian approach. Certainly Carl Rogers did not invent the ideas that are here, but he put them together in a model that really started to embody the sense that we are there for the other person, and that we have a connection to them, a general humanistic connection. So he called good listening accurate empathy, meaning that we can express how we feel in relationship to the other person, as well as reflecting to them what we're feeling based on what they have said. And really what that does is it reflects to them maybe a sense of how they're feeling. If they're trying to talk about some kind of message, like if somebody feels desperate and you say to them, you know, I definitely feel a sense of desperation based on what you're telling me, that A, lets them know that you understand them, but B, it also reflects to them what you're hearing them say. If they said to you, well, actually, I'm not really feeling desperate, I'm just feeling a little bit scared. Okay, so maybe it's not as accurate, but it gives them a chance to reflect to you and kind of and correct you, which is a very powerful thing, by the way, in motivational interviewing. Let them correct you. That's an okay thing. It lets them be in control because they are the ones who are actively looking at the way that you are perceiving their information, and it allows them to say, yeah, you know, I'm going to assess what I just heard them say back to me, and it wasn't right, so I have to correct them on it. It puts them in the driver's seat. Okay. Active listening is what it was called by all kinds of contemporaries of Carl Rogers, which is fine. But we have to be careful that active listening isn't just looking like you're listening. It is actually listening and reflecting and summarizing and prompting and things like that as a way to demonstrate that you are in conversation with the other person. It's absolutely necessary that you develop a sense of good listening, accurate empathy, in order to develop trust and an open relationship. If the other person doesn't feel like you're there for them or that you're not opening up to them, they're not going to trust you. They're not going to believe that you are there to help them. They just think that you're there to listen, and then as soon as you stop talking, they're going to say something different. When we talk to somebody, we don't listen to them and wait for them to stop talking so we can say what we were going to say. We have a conversation, and the conversation needs to be a continuous flow where it's not broken up by you just interjecting what you were going to say. It needs to be based on what the last thing that they said was and kind of flow in a way that makes them feel as if you are attending to their needs, not just listening and waiting for them to stop talking. Now, Gordon's 12 Roadblocks is a model that that's very important for the way that we engage. Remember, we're focused on the engaging phase right now. So Gordon's 12 roadblocks are ways that you can get in the way of engagement. They defeat the purpose. What happens during any of these roadblocks is that it establishes a hierarchical relationship where we fall into the expert trap. We have to be careful about setting up roadblocks because we may shame the interviewee, which is a really, really awful thing to do, to make somebody feel bad about what their experience is like. We're going to take a look at these 12 roadblocks in a little bit more detail. They're also available in a resource folder on Blackboard, but the link that is provided in this slide is going to point you in the right direction as well. And by the way, you can find Gordon's model in lots of different places, just as happens to come from the website Gordon's model. But these 12 roadblocks get in the way, and some are more obvious than others. So ordering. Ordering is an idea where we give somebody a command or tell them to do something. That obviously undermines autonomy. And when we go through these, you're going to notice that it undermines one of the things that we are trying to help with, like developing ambivalence, developing autonomy, and having the other person in the role of the expert or in charge, which is kind of like autonomy, which is the ability to make their own decisions. But when we actively promote them to make their own decisions, then they are in charge. So ordering, making people do something, or asking them to do something, or telling them to do something. It could even be as harmless as something like, hey, why don't you try this? Okay, probably not a bad idea, and it's meant with a good heart, but generally that has more to do with you giving them an answer or ordering them to do something. Or warning, something like, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Or that doesn't sound like a good idea. That is, what that does is that means that we are assessing some kind of value or some kind of moral to what they're saying. Even if it is a bad idea, they're the ones who need to come up with the idea that it's a bad idea. So if somebody says something like, the way that I feel better is just by drinking. If I were going to warn them, I may say something like, that's not really a good idea. That's a warning. But if I say something like, in the past you've drunk when you felt this way, how did that turn out in the past for you? Okay. So that's really more of them coming up with their own conclusions to it. Moralizing is when we attribute some kind of moral shame to somebody. If we make somebody feel like that they quote unquote shouldn't or should do something because it's the right or wrong thing to do. People need to develop their own sense of morals. So if they say something like, I think that I can still drive my car after I drink a couple beers, and you say something like, you shouldn't do that, right? Which is kind of a loaded thing because it's also kind of a warning, and it may also be a questioning type thing. But what I'm suggesting to them is that they are wrong. Now, obviously, it's not a good idea to drink or to drive after you've drunk 2 beers, right? That's I'm not suggesting that it's a good idea. But what I am suggesting is that they need to develop their own sense of morality. Otherwise, they're just going to rely on ours in order to make a decision. You can get to that point. You can question their morals. So you can say something like, it sounds like you're okay with drinking and driving. And then you have a conversation about morals, right? So that's more about exploring morality as opposed to it as moralizing. You shouldn't do that. Okay. All that does is make them feel like a little kid. Advising, and again, advising when it's used early on in the session can be a roadblock because what it does is, again, it makes them feel like that you are in charge and that you're the one who has the answer. So watch out for advising. Using logic, and I know that it sounds peculiar to think, oh, gee, we shouldn't use logic. Using logic is kind of like where you try to convince somebody of something using if-then statements. And there are lots of other ways to use logic. But what it really does is that it serves to confuse somebody or to use wordplay in order to make a point. So we got to be careful of that. So if someone says something like, my stupid boss wanted me to come in on a Saturday. And if I said something like, well, hold on a second. If your boss were stupid, your boss wouldn't be in charge. Okay, so obviously there's some other things that go in there, but it's a logical thing. And really what it does is it makes that person feel defensive. Plus it's incorrect. It's an inappropriate syllogism. People who are in charge are often stupid. Isn't that something? But that's not necessarily true. If you want to talk about logical arguments and affirming the antecedent and things like that, we can talk about that in cognitive psychology. But the idea here is that using logic usually makes people feel bad or makes people feel as if the way that they think is incorrect or wrong. Okay. Praising is another thing that sounds like it would be a good thing to do, but really what praising does, let me start with criticizing. Criticizing is clearly not a good thing to do. Criticizing is when you offer negative feedback, not because it's prudent to be negative, but really what it means is that you are being critical of something that somebody has done, where you want to step through it and tear it apart piece by piece. So if you're being critical, you're normally kind of shredding somebody's story and making them almost feel like even if they made a good decision, they made a wrong decision. Or another way that you can criticize somebody is to make them explain every detail of their thought process to you, which can be very daunting because we don't often keep track of our thought processes that that much. We have to be careful that we're allowed to kind of skip steps when we're describing things. Otherwise, we get burdened by a thought process. And it leads you to feel neurotic about the fact that you can't express every single aspect of your thought process. Blaming and judging also comes into criticizing. So when we judge other people, then they're going to end up judging themselves, is kind of how the saying goes. So people learn to be judgmental. And again, we make judgments about right and wrong, good and bad, and that's fine. But what we're talking about is through critically judging somebody, we are levying some kind of assessment of what their value is. So we have to be careful about how we criticize somebody, especially their thought process and things like that. Praising is another kind of roadblock that you think would be a good thing, but the reality about praising is that you will assess somebody's attempts at finding a solution without letting them do it themselves. So if I say, you did a really great job with that, and you do it early on with an easy decision, you're going to make them feel like that they require praise in order to do something. Now, being very careful using praise appropriately is a good idea. So if somebody has been working on something therapeutically, something like, I finally told my boss that I needed some time off because I was just working myself to the bone. And I say something like, that's a really big deal. Congratulations for taking that leap and just kind of asking your boss for time off. That's an appropriate way to praise somebody, but not just for the sake of praising somebody to make them feel good. Okay. Now, labeling is a trap. We've talked about that. It's a trap according to motivation interviewing. But labeling is when you assign some kind of name to an idea as a way of kind of euphemizing it. So if you say something like, you're just an anxious person, that's a label. They may be, in fact, an anxious person, but to label them that makes them feel as if that's who they are. We call that reification. So if you tell somebody that they are something, then it tends to reify. It tends to become that thing that they identify with. Now, another way that you can label somebody is by using some kind of stereotype. You can say something like, women are always finding it hard to get places on time because they have to do their hair. Okay, so use a stereotype like that, and that's a label. It makes somebody feel categorized, which can lead to marginalization because you are treating them as if they are a member of a group. We are, right? But you're treating them as a member of a group instead of an individual. And remember that motivation interviewing is person-centered. It doesn't take the entire group into consideration. It works with the individual. They may be part of a group, but we want to work with the individual. Number 9 is analyzing, which is also about interpreting or diagnosing. So what happens with analyzing is that you kind of tell them what their problems are. You tell them, oh, well, here's where you went wrong, or here's what you did right. So it's kind of along the same lines as criticizing, but with analyzing, you're also adding in that sense that you're the expert. So it can be a very duplicitous thing to feel like, oh, they're telling me what I did right or wrong, which is helpful, I guess, objectively, but it's also taking away my autonomy. So you have two separate ideas going on at once. So reassuring, we also call sympathizing or consoling, is when you reduce somebody's sense by maybe giving them too much assurance. And again, it kind of sounds like a good thing. Like we would want to reassure somebody. But the reality is that sometimes people, much of the time, people need to feel exactly how they're feeling without you getting in the way. Lots of time with reassuring, I call it rescuing, to where you rescue somebody from their feelings. One way that people will rescue or reassure is a therapist will ask somebody a question. Let's say that I'm asking my client, you came in last time feeling really good, but now you look incredibly sad. I leave it like that, and the person is quiet. They don't have anything to say. Or they start crying or weeping or something. Okay, if I let the time go and just let the silence build, that person is going to kind of work through some things and maybe come out and share something with me. But if I say something like, it looks like you're having really a hard time with that. Let's come back to it. That's reassuring. That's like patting somebody on the back. It's also rescuing them from a hard emotion. So when we reassure somebody, what we're doing is we are making them feel like what they're going through is either okay and that they don't need to experience it and will do something else. It can also be something that keeps somebody in a certain state. So if somebody is having a really hard time expressing something and you say something like, "This is really hard for you, isn't it?" Okay. Now, it may be an acknowledgement of the effort, which is an important thing. So there's kind of a fine line there. But what you're also doing is you're making them sit in a sense of uncomfort, and you've all of a sudden lost a genuine feeling. If somebody sits and is in a state of quiet and they're kind of contemplating and thinking of how they're feeling and kind of assessing, that's a good thing. But if they're sitting in a state of quiet and they're thinking, oh, everybody goes through this and I'm going through this, so I'm just like everybody else, and all of a sudden their mind starts getting kind of diffused on this kind of rhetoric that you fed them, all of a sudden the reassuring has kicked in, and instead of them thinking about the genuine aspects of their thought process, they're thinking more meta about, oh, how should I be thinking right now? So we have to be careful of that. Questioning, which is also kind of a part of interrogating. So asking a question is one thing, but interrogating to the point that you need to just get information is another. Now, clearly we can ask questions. That's fine. But what we're talking about are overusing questions. So we call that the triple question problem. So if people ask 3 questions in a row, that generally gets construed as some kind of interrogation. We need to watch out for that. So with questioning, you can ask questions. It's fine, but don't train questions one after another. So if you ask a question like, how are you feeling today? And they say, oh, I'm doing okay. And you say something like, okay, well, what can you tell me about how your day went? And they tell you how about their day went. And then you say something like, what else did you do today? And you keep going. So all you're doing is you're just getting this call and response based on questions. And even though those are questions that are interesting to know the answers to, you don't need to ask them all at the same time. So try to split your questions up and only ask questions when they're necessary, not just because you're curious. Your curiosities are important, but it's not always important that you ask a question based on that. Now, last is avoiding. So if somebody brings something up and you try to deflect or talk about something else, you're clearly avoiding. Vice versa, if they try to avoid a question, that can be a roadblock too. So lots of times they'll do it because they're defensive and everything, and they're allowed to be that way because they're the client. But when we do it because either we're uncomfortable or we're trying to let somebody else off the hook, then it becomes avoiding, and that's not really a good idea. It really creates a sense of withdrawing where we teach them that it's okay that when they have a strong feeling or thought that they don't need to think of or talk about it. It is important to talk about those things. Now, will you use these roadblocks from time to time? Sure. Is it going to be a tremendous detriment to therapy if you do? No, not really. What it means is that you have to kind of just actively think about these things. The good news is that the less you think about doing these, the less you will do those things. We really want to focus on using good core skills, not avoiding these skills. There's a paradoxical effect about not thinking about something. You're probably familiar with it, but the more you think about something, the more likely you are to do it, even if it's a negative thing. So when we're thinking about these 12 roadblocks, think more about what to do than what not to do. When you end up doing one of these things, so if you start using logic with somebody or trying to outthink them, usually you'll recognize it and you'll think, well, I really ought not to be doing that, so you'll cut it out. So it's more important that you think about what to do and then what not to do. Being aware of these will help you to avoid them once they happen, though. Now, another important part of the active listening method is to form reflections. When you think of forming a reflection, it can be simple. You use one word. Somebody makes a statement to you and you use one word and that's it. So somebody comes up to you and says, I've had the worst day ever. And you just say back to them, worst. They're going to grab a hold of that and run with it. They're going to say, yeah, it's been the worst. I have never had a worse day. And then they'll kind of talk about what their day is like. Reflections can be one word. You pick on the word that kind of sticks out, the word that maybe the most intense or the least intense, depending on what the context is. and you can reflect that back to them. The good news is that when people don't say what they mean, and you reflect back to them what they've said, and it's wrong, they get a chance to correct you, which is again a great place for them to be. Because if you say something that's incorrect, it gives them an opportunity to correct you, to elaborate, to critically think about what they're thinking on their own, or how they're coming across to the other individual. So when you form these reflections, you give somebody an opportunity to be correct, which is a great thing in motivation interviewing. You can also clarify when things were off. So if they didn't mean something the way that you heard it, you can clarify how you heard them. And that gives them good feedback. Because maybe that's a communication issue that they have, is that sometimes they don't come across the right way. And they don't say what they mean. And that can oftentimes be alleviated by you just reflecting something back to them. Remember that the way that we reflect is that we encode, we hear, and we decode. Somebody says some words. I hear it, that here maybe ought to be in quotes, but I hear it, I interpret what they mean, then I decode it and send it back to them. That's a very simple thing. I listen to their words, I interpret meaning, and I send it back to them the way that I interpreted it. That's a very fine way to form a reflection. It gives an opportunity to reflect on what they're saying to you. Lots of times people will use a question when they are reflecting something back. So they'll say something like, did I hear you say that ... Okay. Or they'll say something like, let me get this right. Did you just say that ... Don't worry about asking questions. You can say something like, when you told me that you're having the worst day, it seemed to me that you were talking about the fact that you missed the bus and you had to walk 3 miles to work. That's all you have to say. It's a statement, it's a reflection. So you can use a statement that assists the reflection, and it gives a little bit more context, and it might even direct them toward the thing that you're focusing on, which is usually based on what the most salient thing that they were talking about. So use a statement to reflect as opposed to just questions. Statements show understanding. Questions show that you don't understand something. Isn't that interesting? When we ask a question, generally it's because we want to know an answer. Now, unless you're a lawyer, which one of the things that lawyers always say is don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. The corollary is only ask questions that you do know the answers to. Everybody else has to ask a question because they don't know the answer. So statements show understanding, like, oh, I understand how this can be the worst day for you. Okay. So if you say something like, I'm going to ask you if I got this right. So let me rephrase this to you. And then you say something back to them. And okay. So really what it does is it just shows that it proves to them, quote unquote, that you are listening. Make a statement. It shows understanding. If you are wrong, they'll let you know. You don't have to ask a question. They'll let you know. The good news about forming a reflection is that it takes away the assumption of what is meant. So you've probably been in a position to where you just assume what somebody meant and then you were wrong, and there are maybe some consequences to it. But in the case of a reflection, you just reflect back to them what you heard, and they can tell you if you got it right or wrong. So it's very interesting. All of this has more to do with making sure that you got something right. And it's nice that you got something right, but it's very powerful when you have it wrong. So don't worry about making the reflection. Whether you're right or you're wrong, something good is going to come of it. Either you got it right and there's some good communication, or you got it wrong and they have an opportunity to reflect back to you and kind of assess how they're coming across to other people. It works well in both directions. Now, the depth of the reflection, again, it can be very simple, like a repetition of a key phrase or a key word, or it can be complex, where you repeat a single word and then you add some meaning, or maybe you make guesses about the meaning, and you wonder about what might be coming next. So somebody says something like, I've had the worst day today, I missed the bus and I had to walk 3 miles to work. I can reflect and say, missing the bus doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun. And I wonder how the rest of your day went as a result of missing the bus and having to walk all the way to work. And then they will respond to me and say, yeah, it really stunk. Or maybe they'll say, when I got to work, it wasn't so bad because, you got air conditioning and things like that, and it was nice and cool in the building. Okay. So whatever it is, you can move the conversation and you have them reflecting on things. And again, that complexity moved the conversation forward. It made a guess about what was happening next. Maybe it talked about some meaning. If I said, it must really stink to to miss the bus and have to walk to work, especially after you just exercised that morning or whatever it is. You can make a guess about the meaning of it, what it means to them. And you can keep the conversation moving. Again, these are all highly contextual depending on what the conversation's looking like. But even a simple reflection like, oh, you missed the bus, that's a good reflection. And it allows them to kind of identify that you've come up with the more salient aspects of their conversation, that they missed the bus, that there's something there, and that it led to a suboptimal conclusion. So the depth of reflection becomes important just for moving the conversation forward. Now, a little bit more complex skill is overshooting and undershooting. And these are good because it kind of puts what we call anchors on a conversation. So overshooting is when you put an anchor on the top of a conversation, and undershooting is when you put an anchor on the bottom of a conversation. Let me give you a couple of examples. Somebody says to me, oh, this has been the worst day. I missed the bus and I had to walk 3 miles to work. And I say, I can't imagine a worse start to the day. And they say to me, well, I mean, yeah, it was bad, but, there are worse ways to start a day, I guess. Okay, good. Now, all of a sudden, we've got them thinking in terms of the positive aspect of their dilemma. Now, this is just a simple example, but think of what it means. All of a sudden, they've gone from thinking, oh, this is the worst day. And worst is superlative, right? Worst means worst. There's nothing worse than the worst. So sensing that the person may be exaggerating, you say, yeah, I can't imagine a worse way to start the day than to miss bus after work and to walk 3 miles to work. Clearly, there are worse ways to start a day, right? But what it does is it gets them thinking more toward the middle, more away from the extremes of their feelings and contextualizing the problem differently. It gets them thinking within some kind of parameters that allows them to be a little bit more on planet Earth than to just think, oh, this was the worst day ever. Now, undershooting works the same way, but in the opposite direction. So if let's say that, so I'm going to change the example a little bit because this may not work so well with undershooting. But if somebody says something like, it's fine, I really don't care if I missed the bus, it's all right. And then I say something like, yeah, I mean, you missed the bus, so what, There's nothing really comes of that. It's not a really big deal, is it? Kind of agreeing with them, but I'm exaggerating, right? I'm undershooting what they've said. So it's a reflection, but I'm undershooting. And they say, well, I mean, if I miss the bus, I could be late to work and get into trouble. Okay, all of a sudden in this example, they've gone from not really caring about missing the bus to developing a sense of urgency about catching the bus. So the undershoot, what it does is it allows them to see that they may not be taking something as seriously as it seems like they might want to. Now, these are delicate to use. You'll more than likely use them accidentally, right? You're probably not going to use them as you're not going to be thinking to yourself, okay, I'm going to overshoot this statement. Here it comes. Okay, here's my overshoot. That's usually not how it's going to happen. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get people either A, to not feel so intense. And now it sounds kind of awful, right? To make somebody not feel a certain way. What we want to do is we want to contextualize feeling, but we want them to feel less intense about something. Because sometimes people will have a very intense feeling when it's not necessary. We'll interpret what the emotion means and why somebody might have such an intense feeling, but the feeling itself is probably exaggerated, which is no surprise because feelings are usually irrational anyways, which lends itself to being an exaggeration anyways. Okay. And then in the context of the feeling, we can also undershoot it by making it feel more intense, like it needs to be dealt with a little bit more seriously. So in either direction, we can kind of put some parameters on the feeling, not to constrain it or to make it go away, but to make the person feel as if they are in more control of a So that's overshooting and undershooting. Now, there are some revisited skills. We're not going to go over them too much, except for maybe just to give a little bit more of a firm definition to them. But we're going to take a look at open questions, affirming, and summarizing, because we've already looked at reflecting. So open-ended questions. Again, open-ended questions give an opportunity to explore. So we can explore something by having an open question. If we ask a yes or no question, somebody can answer yes or no, and that's it. That's usually pretty bad for people who are resistant or reluctant to do therapy or to get treatment of some kind, because they can just say yes or no and be done with the question, and they've answered the question as you asked it. Open-ended question also allow for creativity, so allows the person to kind of come up with some kind of response. It promotes openness, so people can open up, they can talk about something, they can feel comfortable that they can answer as creatively or expressively as they want to. The usual pattern for asking open-ended questions is that you ask an open-ended question, they respond, and then there's a reflection. One thing to avoid is a multiple choice open question, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but here's the deal. Let's say I say something like, how you doing today? And somebody says, oh, I'm doing okay. It's been a pretty good day so far. And, I went grocery shopping and I couldn't use all my coupons, but it was fine. Okay, fine. Good open-ended question. If I say something like, hey, how you doing today? Good or bad? Oh, all of a sudden I've taken a great open question. How you doing today? And all of a sudden I've made it multiple choice, good or bad. Or if I say something like, would you say that your day has been good or bad or what? All of a sudden they've been given choices, even though there's a or what category that allows them to answer freely. The good or bad or whatever gives them two choices to choose from, so they can kind of choose one and they're it. That's it. They can say, oh, it's a good day. Okay, even though it's technically an open answer, it's not an open question because we've given them the choices. And once again, avoid those strings of questions. Now, with affirming, we want to make sure that we acknowledge the other's experience. We recognize that even bad experiences you can acknowledge. Remember that it's not the same as condoning it. We want to use what's called agape, which is pronounced agape, not the word agape. We don't want to be agape. Maybe we would if somebody says something very surprising to us. But agape, so that's a general love for somebody as he or she is. And by the way, the Greeks have it nailed. They've got like 4 or 5 or 6 different versions of love that they talk about. There's like erotic love. There's general love for somebody. There's phileo, which is brotherly love. So there's lots of love going on in the Greek culture, which is kind of nice. But agape is that general love for somebody as he or she is. Not that you condone behaviors, but just the love of humanity, that you wish somebody to have some kind of positive outcome in terms of therapy or treatment or whatever. We want to be interested in the welfare of the other person. That's advocacy at its finest. We want to understand the other and to do it genuinely. We want to affirm them. In order to affirm them, we must know their experiences. And we do want to do it genuinely. Obviously, there are some things that we would not like to affirm, and sometimes you have to be creative to affirm something. But if it comes down to it, you'd rather affirm nothing than negatively affirm something, to say that somebody did something bad. If they did something bad, you can tell them that, but only in the context of letting them find out that what they did was bad. See, it's a little bit of trickery, but remember, we can't tell them they did something bad, because what that means is that we came up with the idea and they didn't. Then they rely on us to tell them they did something bad. When we affirm, we reduce defensiveness and increase engagement. If somebody can admit to you they did something bad and you say, you know what, I appreciate that it was hard for you to tell me that. That's an affirming statement, and it reduces their defensiveness and it increases engagement. We can also affirm the future by saying, you know what, I'll bet you if you kept this up, you'd be very successful. Something very affirming. If you kept this same trend, you'd be very successful in the future. Okay. And what we also want to do is to teach self-affirmation. So we can say something like, you heard me say that you did a good job. I wonder if you ever tell yourself that. And they can kind of reflect, well, I don't really give myself a lot of credit. And okay, well, it feels good, right? Well, maybe you shouldn't say that. But you could say, how does it feel when I tell you that you feel, or that I appreciate your efforts, or whatever the affirmation is. And they can say, well, it makes you feel good. And I was like, well, I wonder if you couldn't feel that way just by telling yourself. So we can teach somebody else to affirm that, through that self-affirming. All right, so to summarize, we want to use reflections, but we will encompass more information. So a reflection is just a simple statement. And to summarize is to come up with kind of a short story, a very short story, like 2 or 3 sentences, when somebody has given you a lot of information. So you can say something like, let me make sure I got this right, and then go into a summary. All right. It demonstrates the way that their entire thought process is interpreted. Because when you tell a story, what you're really doing is taking a bunch of ideas and stringing them together. And there is a basic idea, kind of like a thesis to an essay, right? Where there is a basic idea that comes out of it, but that basic idea is, told through a series of paragraphs or sentences or whatever. What it also does is it allows the other person to tell me if I missed something important. So if I give a summary and I've left out some information, they're going to tell me, and that's a great position, because what it does is it tells me what's important to them. So if I say a sentence that takes me 30 seconds to recite and they say, yeah, but you missed this part, the part that I missed that they reminded me of is probably a very important part, or else they wouldn't acknowledge it. It also allows me to, for me, but for them to tell me what else might be going on. So it gives me a what else statement. So if I say, here's what you've told me, what else can you tell me about this? And it allows them an opportunity to reflect back to me what they've heard me say. We can usually link things together by summarizing. So if we had a comment earlier in the session and it's kind of relevant to what they're talking about now, even though they didn't talk about it at the same time, I can summarize and I can say, it sounds like you told me A, B, and C. I wonder if it doesn't tie back into what you were telling me earlier when you were talking about X, Y, and Z. So you can tie those back together. You can also transition from topic to topic or to the end of a session. Summarizing is a very good way to end a session. You can say, we've only got a little bit of time left. Here's what we talked about. And we might have another, 2 minutes to talk about something else. But here's what I've heard from you this session. Reflect on the session. Maybe talk about what they might want to continue talking about during the next session. Then you can end the session. So it's a good transition. The good news is that you can also summarize ambivalence. You can say something like, you came in here not sure what you were going to do about changing jobs. You talked about why you would want to change jobs, and you can kind of reiterate a few of the ideas. Then you talked about why you don't want to change jobs, reiterate some of those ideas. Then you can ask them, what kind of thoughts do you have on talking about what we did today and whether or not you're going to change jobs. And it gives them the last word, and it allows them to kind of reflect on their ambivalence and maybe come up with a decisional balance or something. The idea behind summarizing the ambivalence is that we want to point out that there either is still some ambivalence or that there is a difference between what they want and where they are now. Remember, that's that developing discrepancy idea. Okay, so let's stop there. There was, in just a few short slides, there was a lot of information. Now, obviously, we're going to be practicing so that you'll be able to get some of these skills out in the open, and you'll be able to practice and work with somebody on their issues, and you'll fumble, and that's okay. And you'll be thinking, oh, no, I just asked a closed question. That's okay. Keep going. And, you won't be so neurotic after a while, but for a little while, you're going to be thinking about every word that you're saying, and it's okay. Just remember that you're talking to somebody, and above all, it's a conversation. When you feel stuck, just be curious. Wonder about something. Okay. So I look forward to seeing what you can do with this stuff in class through your interview practicing.